Okay, and we're going live. So good morning, good evening, good night to everyone, and welcome to this second lecture in our seminar series on decolonizing global health, hosted by Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service through the Science, Technology and International Affairs program, as well as the Center for Global Health Science and Security. And so just for everyone's awareness, as the series is live. So good morning, good evening, good night to everyone. And because there are students joining us in the Zoom room, you'll see their faces on the YouTube live stream. At the end of the lecture, they'll be able to ask questions directly. For those of you joining us live on YouTube, please feel free to add comments into the chat, the comment section underneath the video. We'll do our best to moderate those and add them into the discussion if there's time as well. So just as a quick recap, in the first lecture, we were taken beyond acknowledging that there is a problem in global health in terms of inequality and equity to examine the data in detail, which demonstrated that across every metric you can think of in global health research, high-income countries, and particularly white men from high-income countries, dominate the discourse on global health research. But having a baseline of data, while it provides a useful starting point for effective change, we want to take that a step further. Moreover, we're hoping that the COVID-19 pandemic may provide opportunities for shifting the balance of discourse towards countries and individuals that have been previously excluded. So today we're going to be moving beyond this overview of the legacies of colonialism on global health research and learn more about its direct impacts on individual and population health, and specifically within the spheres of gender, identity, violence, and displacement. We are absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Amelia Viteri, a research professor at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito and a research associate at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Viteri is an applied cultural and sociolinguistic anthropologist who examines the central role that race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and migrant status play in structural inequality, including displacement, lack of access to health, safe housing, education, nutrition, economic empowerment, and community development across the Americas. Dr. Viteri has published extensively in English and in Spanish for academic audiences, the media, and also to inform public policy. She's also published a book related to her efforts called Desbordes, Translating Racial, Ethnic, Sexual, and Gender Identities Across the Americas, which sounds very fascinating. So very quickly, before I hand over to you, Dr. Viteri, I just want to reiterate to everyone listening the importance of leaning into our discomfort when discussing these challenging and yet sensitive topics. And we should also all practice the gift of grace and empathy, as we may all be on different parts of our path towards greater understanding and learning within this space. So let's bear those concepts in mind for our discussion. And so with that, it is my absolute pleasure to hand over to Dr. Viteri for her lecture, The Colonial Legacy, Rethinking Health Equity in the Global South. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to Ali and Richard as well for the introduction. And it's wonderful to be a speaker at this important series, the Decolonizing Health series. I also want to thank you, the STIA program, the Georgetown Medical Center, the Georgetown Center for Global Health Science and Security. And as Dr. Stanley was saying, these issues, the topics that we are about to discuss together are definitely those that make most people uncomfortable. But I always tell my students and the colleagues that I collaborate with that it's within feeling uncomfortable when we can be better in theorizing, in coming up with new methodologies, because when we are uncomfortable, we usually tend to think outside the box, and that is a good thing. So I usually see certain forms of being uncomfortable as actually positive because it brings creativity. In that sense, I'm going to start saying that we are all marked, all of us, in one way or the other, by our colonial relations and their intersections. It doesn't matter from which country we're originally from or where do we live, we are marked by our colonial relations. As an anthropologist, in order to rethink health equity, for me, a good starting point is to acknowledge and understand what are those colonial legacies, and also how do those colonial legacies play out in our lives. Once we are able to conduct this, what I believe is a thoughtful exercise, not easy, we can also move towards understanding how these colonial relations, how these colonial legacies play out in the larger world and in terms of the issues that concern us all. So this talk builds from two examples in order to illustrate, in this case, how Ecuador, and it can also be extrapolated to other parts of Latin America, the global south, continues to suffer from negative health and well-being outcomes due in, among other variables, due to the inheritance of colonial practices. When we look at the Galapagos Islands political ecology of violence, or at the intersections of immigrant status, sexual identity, and the COVID-19 pandemic on LGBTI Venezuelan refugees and immigrants in Ecuador, the ongoing influence of colonial legacies and practices is appalling, as you will see. Colonization brought and enforced, among many other things, what we call a binary worldview towards, for example, gender and sexuality, as well as race and ethnicity. Through this talk, I will discuss what I see is an urgent need to undo colonial cultural practices and imaginaries that have not only pervasively remained, but that have become institutionalized, not only at the subjective level, of course, but in terms of all the institutions that in many ways command our lives. This colonial legacy continues to shape women, girls, indigenous, and LGBTQ communities' health with lasting and negative impacts. So let's look at the colonial legacy and the colonial heritage. Now, not everyone knows where Ecuador is located. Not everyone has to know. So I'm going to start kind of refreshing our geography, because as we know, context and geographical context matters. So Ecuador is located in Western South America on top of the equator. That's where it takes its name. It is bordered by the Pacific Ocean, Colombia to the north, Peru to the east and south. It is considered among the most biodiverse countries in the world. It includes the Amazon jungle, the Andean highlands, and the wildlife-rich Galapagos Islands. There are 14 indigenous nationalities living in the country, grouped into local, regional, and national organizations. According to the United Nations Population Fund, Ecuador also has the second highest rate of adolescent pregnancies in Latin America, after Venezuela. A majority of these pregnancies are a product of sexual violence perpetrated by a family member. A study I conducted with the international organization Plan International on cultural patterns of violence against girls and women illustrates a generalized bias against girls, particularly those that live in rural areas that belong to peasant, Afro-descendant, or indigenous communities. They are hardly ever regarded as victims and survivors. Instead, the girls and teenagers are blamed for their sexual abuse, facing punishment from their families as well as discrimination by both the healthcare services and the legal services, who are supposed to protect them. Having said this, as an anthropologist, I invite us to reflect upon what are the state's colonial heritages. For instance, women's bodies are still governed by what we call a colonial matrix that prevents women, girls, and transgender people's fair access to reproductive health and reproductive justice. We can hence imply that heteronormativity is also governed by a coloniality of power that becomes embodied. The coloniality of power is a theoretical concept and methodology, I would say, coined by scholar Aníbal Quijano to name the structures of power, control, and hegemony that have emerged during the modernist era with continuities from the conquest of the Americas to the present. Now, let's zoom in and look at the Galapagos Islands and its colonial legacy. Galapagos colonial history is different from the continent, from Ecuador, and from many other countries. Ecuador had prison colonies in the Galapagos until the middle of the 20th century. And we have Manuel Cobos, who founded one of the inhabited islands, San Cristobal, in 1866, where I have conducted most of my extensive research, and where Universidad San Francisco has its Galapagos Research Center. Manuel Cobos created what will be known as the Cobos Empire quotation, using prisoners shipped from Guayaquil for forced labor and slavery on his sugarcane and coffee plantations. He was eventually killed by the enslaved workers, but despite this history, descendants of these slave owners have been elected as mayors up until the present day. One example among many others where you can see the mechanisms of the colonial legacies who have been internalized not only by the population, but by the system. We also have land as another key word when we think and talk about colonial legacies. The transformation of land into property was consolidated socially through the invention of what we call racialization in the colonies. Nevertheless, it's important to also remind us that Spanish conquistadores didn't ban intimacy between indigenous and African women and Spanish men, opposite to, for example, what the English and French did, who invented a structure of racialization central to the development of scientific justifications of white superiority. The links between this colonial structure, the environment, the economy, and human health in the Galapagos Islands are central to understanding as well the negative effects of increased domestic violence, as currently magnified by the pandemic COVID-19. Research conducted on the Galapagos Islands on this issue has been almost inexistent, despite having unusually high levels of domestic violence. 1 in 3 women in the Galapagos experience gender-based violence. Based on the data collected in the baseline study on gender-based violence and the first diagnostic of social protections in the Galapagos Islands that I conducted with Universidad San Francisco de Quito, 83% of women have indicated that they or someone they know have suffered some form of physical violence. These diagnostics also offer an assessment of the main gender and social inclusion gaps in policies and procedures that prevent women from accessing rights in the Galapagos Islands, including policy reform recommendations to integrate gender and social inclusion into the archipelago's social protection system. Our study also found that women often avoid going to healthcare facilities in the islands due to a sense of mistrust and a fear of disclosure of their medical histories, because in their past experiences, confidentiality is not necessarily honored. Experience has shown that nothing remains private in the islands, and even brutal crimes are subject to gossip. In the context of COVID-19, this lack of institutional guarantees creates gendered impacts that might result in women being more vulnerable to the disease and unequal access to healthcare. The systems for the prevention and protection for gender-based violence across the inhabited islands of the Galapagos, Santa Cruz Island, San Cristobal Island, Floriana Island, and Isabela Island, provide little to no institutional support for women or children victims of domestic violence. The main findings highlight how high levels of legal impunity translate into social impunity and vice versa, one feeds the other. The effects of COVID-19 have exacerbated this trend, as 9/11 reports in Ecuador show. Nevertheless, our research findings also highlight that a considerable number of women across the island have been organizing around either politics, the environment, or small businesses, creating safe spaces for themselves, their children, and their communities. Strengthening the civil society through women's active leadership can positively influence cultural imaginaries that continue to allow social impunity towards different types of violence. These interventions, together with policy change that acknowledges the situated context that human inhabitants face in the Galapagos, that are very different from those on the continent, could help to reduce gender-based violence and other forms of violence. An approach that sees the environment with its human and non-human species as integrated could strengthen the rule of law and the solidarity required. Now let's tie these, I invite you to tie these with another keyword, which is that of heteronormativity. Ecuador is at the center of regional migration flows, and discrimination against Venezuelan immigrants and refugees in Ecuador has increased with the pandemic. Venezuelan folks like Luis, who lives in Manta, or Andrea, who lived in Quito and then moved to Guayaquil, had to leave Venezuela due to the catastrophic economic, political, and social conditions in their native country. Together with the discrimination they have suffered based on their gender and or sexual identity. Here you can see the crossroads of migration, refugee, gender, and sexuality within the pandemic context that cannot be dismissed, as they feed another colonial legacy, that of heteronormativity. Together with the LGBTI organization Diálogo Diverso, my team and I conducted a mixed methods research study in order to map the impact of the pandemic on the LGBTI Venezuelan immigrants and refugees in Quito, Guayaquil, and Manta. Quito is located in the Andes and it's Ecuador's capital city, and it's where I was originally born, while Guayaquil and Manta are located on the coast. Some of the staggering data show us that 89% of Venezuelan immigrants and refugees have no income or source of employment. The few that were able to find some form of income were required, for example, to work more than 10 hours daily at a restaurant and were paid only $10 per day. 58% experienced a xenophobic situation, the majority in public services, mostly transportation, followed by health provision, education, and housing. These data raises additional red flags and the need to decolonize health by changing the perceptions that healthcare providers have of not only immigrants and refugees, but also LGBTIQ communities. These perceptions are usually loaded, as we know, with negative and stereotypical ideas that are conscious and unconscious, and misinformed facts on what it means to belong to one of these communities or to all these communities simultaneously. Transgender Venezuelans reported facing increased discrimination compared with non-transgender cis Venezuelans. Compounding these layers of discrimination, there is also the rhetoric of the fundamentalist religious groups that are attacking sexual and reproductive rights, together with LGBT rights in the name of the family. These groups describe the struggles by women, LGBTQ groups, and human rights discourses as, open quotes, imperialist foreign forces, which are seen as an external threat to the presumed purity of Latin American families. As we discussed extensively in the publications available at Sexuality Policy Watch's website through the Gender and Politics in Latin American project, these groups use apocalyptic narratives that denounce the existence of an international lobby described as, for example, pro-gay or abortionist and promoting gender ideology. Concentrating disproportionately on sexual and reproductive issues is therefore another colonial legacy. It's a strategy whereby conservative religious leaders focus on the intimate lives and the personal choices of women and LGBTI people. In the process, what has happened is that women and same-sex couples are sacrificed. Why? Because their lives are considered to be inferior, less normal, less human, and hence less important. A decolonial approach that will foster health equity will place gender and sexuality politics at the center. By doing so, we could better understand how these different mechanisms impeach health equity, as these are rooted in subjective and institutionalized practice. I'm going to start closing because I would love to, I'm happy to expand in any and all of these points. I would definitely love to hear some of your questions and comments. So as I have discussed, the links between the environment, the economy, migration, refugee status, and human health are central when we think about decolonizing, decolonization, and the colonial legacies. The perspective of gender and sexuality politics is hence essential to rethink and revisit global health equity, particularly in an era of COVID-19. The transnational phenomenon of coordinated, for example, anti-gender campaigns is also as an important part of what scholars Sonia Correa and Richard Parker call the de-democratization dynamics. The colonial legacies, hence, are and have been depolitizing the public sphere and the social life. And this translates into eroding the autonomy of what is political, what is considered political, and hence what is considered important, what interventions are considered important, politically speaking. And so they also disqualify the presence and participation of particular types of people in political life. Now, following Tuhiwai Smith's work, I believe we should also understand that decolonization is an ongoing process. Tuhiwai Smith will say, I'm quoting, divesting from colonial power. What does divesting from colonial power mean? It could help us dig deep into our own colonial legacies, reminding ourselves that those colonial legacies are imprinted, are embodied, and hence many, if not most, are unconscious. And if we cannot name them, it's really hard to change them. So how do we start naming our own colonial legacies so that we can recognize those in any other area of our life, of our work, and of our interventions? In that way, intervening in the mechanisms that hold those colonial legacies in place could be more productive, could be more fruitful. Doing so could help as well expose the social, cultural, and political factors that so often set some up to be healthy and case others aside as expendable. These distinctions between who is deserving of care, who is deserving of punishment, multiply as well the lethality of viruses and abuse alike. So I invite you to continue thinking through these issues and thinking about gender-based violence and different types of violence, LGBT phobia, as other type of viruses that, in connection with all these inequalities, then make it sometimes extremely difficult to actually address what are the ways in which certain, for example, gender and sexual regimes, race and ethnic regimes operate within the actual institutions. When I think and talk about institutions, I'm thinking about family as an institution, I'm thinking about the state, I'm thinking about education as an, I'm thinking about all these structures, social media, the press, that are constantly informing how we think about issues, what issues matter, and all these institutions will reproduce in one way or the other some of the colonial legacies that I have described. And with this, I would like to stop here and open the forum for comments, questions, so as to expand on what I have shared. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. That's a wonderful introduction to some incredible work that you've done, both the research on the Galapagos and also with the migrant communities from Venezuela. I have quite a lot of questions and things I'd like to explore. So maybe I'll start off with one question and then give everyone else a chance to think through their thoughts. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to maybe the political context in Ecuador right now in terms of the balance of power between indigenous people from indigenous backgrounds versus those with more of a European heritage, and how that plays out in the context of Ecuador. I spent a bit of time in Bolivia, and obviously there was a big change with the election of Evo Morales a few years ago. So I'm just curious how that's playing out in Ecuador.
Oh, absolutely. That's an excellent question. Thanks, Claire. We had, I'm going to start from the end. So we had a huge revolt, we had a huge march country-wise in October, this past October. So current President Moreno was going to take away the gas, the oil subsidy. And that triggered huge response and against these policies because they will increment some of the main products that the majority of the population will need to buy. Indigenous leaders were leading these discourses and the protests against these, what we can call structural adjustment, economic structural adjustment proposed by the government. In some ways, depending how you want to analyze it. So if you look at it from a social justice perspective, we can say that it was successful because it reminded Ecuadorians and many others in the world that indigenous communities are not only present, but have agency, have a voice, and that are able to mobilize very quickly and very successfully. The president had to stop his policy, and some terms were agreed. I will say that not all the terms will necessarily benefit the indigenous communities and others, but the fact that the indigenous communities had such successful power, I believe, was key in order to understand how this how October played out. In that sense, we also want to look at what has happened in Ecuadorian politics 10 years ago. So our former president, Rafael Correa, had this strong discourse of what he called the Bolivarian Revolution or 21st century socialism, which definitely changed some of the, say, a specific example. Our constitution since 2008 recognizes that gender and sexual identities need to be respected. It's among the few constitutions in the world that includes that as a non-discrimination clause in the constitution. Now, as we know, one thing is what's written in the constitution, another thing is what actually happens, right? So if you read our constitution and you read nothing else about Ecuador, you will say they are so advanced. Well, in legal terms, yes. But then again, how does that play out in the actual respect for LGBT rights and others is a different thing. What I mentioned with research on and what we call anti-gender policies, which basically means an attack on groups that are or any laws or similar policies that are trying to protect LGBT rights and women and girls' rights through sexual and reproductive rights. These groups emerged out very strongly in former President Correa's presidency. In fact, through the research that we carried out with Sexuality Policy Watch, we know that President Correa was the first president that mentioned gender ideology as a negative thing in one of his speeches to the nation. So here you can see how politics around particular ideology, like 21st century socialism, could be contradictory to the actual policies in place and could be or has been very contradictory in terms of indigenous communities' rights. Indigenous communities' rights have not been honored. Opposite, in terms of extractivism, through alliances with China, the larger protected areas of the Amazon are now being drilled. And other protected areas have mining company, mostly from China, operating. And indigenous voices and the distraction that is bringing to them have been little to no heard, except for a recent winning of a case from the Waorani community, which were able to hold Ecuadorian government accountable for not having consulted them before conducting extractivist activities in their territory. And I'm so glad for your question, Dr. Stanley, because what's also at stake is how do we understand ideology, left wing, right wing. And when I was talking about the democratization and how the colonial legacies are feeding into the democratization of the public sphere, what I'm analyzing is if we stay in, especially, I think also in the United States, but in Latin America, if we stay in an analysis of right as antagonistic to left only, it's not going to get us very far in our discussions because there are many correlations between left and right. And now, as you might have seen, the new left, right, where, for example, Professor Chomsky is part of the new left, Bernie Sanders is part of the new left. They have invited former President Correa to be part of this movement. And depending on which aspect of President Correa you want to analyze, I'm not sure if he's really a new left advocate, except in his rhetoric. So what does that mean when now you have the virtual world, let's say, to come up with any reality you want to present, as we are seeing in the United States? So that disconnect between your actual politics, what's happening in the ground, and what you are saying you're doing, I believe now more than ever is something that we have to be really mindful about. So President Moreno was part of President Correa's same political party, except that President Moreno decided to change, let's say, his discourse and let's say go back, if we, I don't even know if that's accurate, but more like show more to the world his agreements with, for example, the multilateral organizations, so IMF, the loans with IMF, with the World Bank, with the IDB, but also with China. The loans and the debt we have with China have not stopped with whatever. So what we have now is one more new empire in which we have a huge debt with, I will say, less human rights provisions and more sneaky terms of the contracts in which we have no access to. So very complicated scenario.
Yes, but a very important reminder also, I think, especially to those of us who sometimes think of global health in sort of an infectious disease vacuum. I'm an infectious disease biologist by training. And so remembering that it's important to look at these things through the eyes of anthropologists, through the eyes of social scientists, through the eyes of political scientists is absolutely crucial for us, I think. And we have a great question from the audience. Ali, I will ask it for Ali because her sound's not great, but she asks, could you speak to how policies restricting immigration to the Galapagos, so including from mainland Ecuador as well as elsewhere, and the protected land on the islands for ecological and presumably touristic reasons as well, impact the undocumented populations of women who are seeking health services there?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I will have to reply pre-COVID and then during COVID. So pre-COVID, what I found in my research is, for example, and this is very interesting because former President Correa also created more categories of immigrants in the Galapagos. So made it more difficult that a person can become a resident. Made it really difficult. But here you have a very specific example as follows. If you're a sex worker, it will be easier for you to have a work permit for 3 months in the Galapagos. When that work permit will end, you can go back to the continent and then ask for another work permit and go back to the island. So doctors, both doctors and sex workers that I work with in the islands told me that it's easier for a sex worker to have a work permit than for a doctor or a nurse to have a work permit, for example. And what happened here is that you can see what's playing out and the precarity that these new hierarchies of immigrants have created in the Galapagos Islands. Because there are indigenous communities, particularly from the Andes, that are living and have their businesses in the Galapagos, which have been placed in a different hierarchy than, for example, lighter non-indigenous mestizos. They have created their own communities. For example, when I was there in I believe it was the Christmas festivities, there was a specific parade for the Galapagueños, and where they have all their Santa Claus and you name it. And there was another different parade from the indigenous communities with traditional dances and traditional clothes, traditional music, but the two were separated, as happens in other parts of the continent. But I think that tells a lot. So I believe that, and with COVID, all immigration was stopped. All tourism was also stopped. That has changed. So I would not necessarily believe that the healthcare system in the Galapagos is so precarious that even if you are a person that have means, economic means, you have to resort to the clinics in the continent because you cannot trust the clinics in the Galapagos. You will think how the Galapagos, having such a huge tourist influx, does not have at least one hospital, one clinic that actually works for emergencies. Because if you are a tourist, and I say this because my cousin Amelia owns a boat, so I know it firsthand as well, in addition to be a researcher. most of the tourists will be in a boat, in a cruise. So if you get sick, what they will do is fly you in a helicopter to the continent. They will not fly you to the closest healthcare clinic in the Galapagos. I can give you my own example. And I had a stomach bug while I was conducting research there in San Cristobal, and the laboratory didn't have what was needed to know what type of bug I had or the medicine. So I basically had to call my doctor in Quito and wait till I was able to go back to Ecuador in order to do the clinical test for something that you will think it's easier, right? Which is a stomach bug. In addition to that, what we did see, addressing the question, is that there are strong policies towards the protection of the environment and non-human species. And so there are two discourses, two narratives that are contradicting one and the other. One is the environmental narrative, and the other one is the tourist narrative. So, in both, in one way or another, as you might know, have made invisible the human communities living in the islands. So, for example, because my work is between Ecuador and the United States, when I will tell my colleagues at the University of Kentucky or at the University of Maryland, etc., that I was conducting research in Galapagos, many will ask me, like, are people living there? How I thought, some people were not living there, or were very few people living there. It's 10,000 plus. This is not a small number. That means that the policies have focused mostly on environmental protection, which doesn't mean that they work as we would like, but little on the human. And what I mentioned at the end, the integration, that's why we call the project the political ecology of violence. If we think about human and non-human species as separated, then without an integration of all these beings, then the policies will continue to favor one and disregard the other. So there's certainly a connection, um, going back to the question on the policies focused on environmental protection have constricted women and other people's access to health services. And we can hypothesize that that's one of the reasons why there's not a reliable healthcare system for the people that actually live in the Galapagos. Another thing that I mentioned that we found out, which has to do with your question, is that undocumented populations in Galapagos are, of course, face different forms of discrimination. They cannot work as the others, and they are also usually subject to very precarious work, as I mentioned earlier. And the health services do not necessarily follow the protocols. And the biggest problem, the largest problem I found, is the confidentiality issue. So not following the protocols when there's an issue, for example, domestic violence attack, and there are visible signs of that violence in your body, and there are pictures that the hospital nurse needs to take. Those pictures need to go to a folder that's confidential. Instead of that, that picture can easily circulate in WhatsApp or in the Galapagos Island social media, one of social media Facebook pages, re-victimizing the women in this particular case.
Thank you. Yes, and I think you actually anticipated one of the other questions that has just come in on the chat here from Kate. So you mentioned during your talk again this lack of confidentiality, and I wonder if you could just break down the factors that might contribute to a gender disparity, specifically when it comes to confidentiality. Is it that women are stigmatized more, or do men benefit from greater confidentiality? Are there gender-specific issues at play there?
Right. Yeah, definitely gender specific issues and also what we have called um, what will be in English like a network of compliance and social that causes social impunity. So although people, when you initially ask both men and women about gender-based violence, the first response will be, "No, we are in this paradise. Look around you, right? The sea lions, the blue-footed wildebeest. How can you imagine? No, violence. There's violence in the continent, and delinquency, and all sorts of problems. Not here." Then, when you dig in deeper, you could see that everyone has experienced some form of violence. And then those colonial legacies that are so gender and unequal reproduce in the Galapagos Islands, meaning that the women and the girls, the teenagers, are the ones to blame for whatever happens. And because it's very small island, everyone knows everyone else. So there's a tendency, based on the research, that families and others will protect the man independently of what he has done. So if, let's say, your son has violent, has caused any form of violence to the wife, and the wife decides to take action with the police, then that family will know someone in the police, or a lawyer that will, I won't say easily, get these men out of that trouble, quotation marks. So you could see how gender disparities that are inherited from two colonial legacies, right? Ecuadorian and the Galapagos, which, as I mentioned earlier, are different, are informing a dismissal of women and girls' bodies, a sense of inferiority in the sense of these bodies are less important, so we're going to protect the victimizer and not the victim. And we saw that both in the quantitative surveys that we conducted, as well as in the qualitative work we conduct.
Well, and actually, we've got a number of questions coming in on the chat through YouTube as well. So I'll just jump to one of them. So this is sort of maybe a general question that spans both of your projects. So we know that systems perpetuate these colonial attitudes, and educational systems perpetuate them as well. So what are the kinds of necessary changes that maybe can be done at different levels of education, but maybe for the purposes of this talk specifically at the higher education sector, to try and dismantle some of these dangerous attitudes and break the system to improve it?
Yeah, absolutely. With the Galapagos, as well as the LGBTI Venezuelan Immigrant and Refugee Project, something that I found and that I highlight as part of my response is we saw these incredible leadership from women in the Galapagos, from different women's organizations, collectives, or groups. And one of my recommendations was to the Galapagos Council and their authorities and leadership was, instead of trying to advocate for new collectives or organizations, or creating a new organization, strengthen those that have been doing the work. Even if the work has not been specifically fighting against gender-based violence or similar, they are already organized and they are doing very positive things for their community, and they are the ones that know their community more than anyone else. So they will know how to reach the teacher, the kids, the families, and so forth. And that has proven successful in different parts of the world. So strengthening leadership, strengthening women's leadership, strengthening children's leadership, strengthening indigenous leadership, and strengthening LGBTI leadership. I think that's definitely one thing that has to be done more, because the civil society is then strengthened. And if the civil society is strengthened, then if there's legal impunity civil society calls for non-impunity and calls for social action. What I'm thinking about is the power of social stigma, because again, we might have the best legal jurisdiction and policies in place. I gave you the example of Ecuador's constitution, extremely progressive. But if it's not doing its work, then you fall short. So I'm at the point, in my life, in my career, that I believe even more in the strengthening of civil society to hold the institutions accountable, the educational institutions, government, the family, all the institutions, held them accountable. And for that, what needs to happen, and I go back to this over and over again, but I think it's the most difficult thing to do, is to start with our immediate community. Start with oneself. Because if you cannot recognize your colonial legacies, your biases, however you choose the word, you choose how you want to name it. If we are unable to recognize our own biases, then how can we apply those to our fields of research or our fields of our careers and to our industries? You have to know your own. And also, if you can influence your immediate community, that's a change that is tangible, which in turn will influence, if you think about it, generations to come. You might say I'm utopian, but I'm here thinking through the tradition of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, and those traditions have not proven wrong. They again and again are reminding us that collective action can be successful for change, and then collective action for education and intervening, right? So interrupting in the best way you believe works with your community, because you have to, because you know your community, you know how to engage in a discussion that's uncomfortable with your community, whereas I might not know. How do I speak with your community? It's not the same. Right? You will have more tools, and vice versa. Right? I might have more tools with my community because I know their colonial legacies more than others. So I think that changing the way we look at intervention, and if we wait for the state to do it, just wait. The government will do it. The government shall do it, or whatever ministry or senator, you name it. We're gonna wait forever. I tell you. And you have examples in the United States, in Ecuador, in Latin America, that are successful examples of civil society holding their politicians accountable. It doesn't work like this, right? It's not like automatic. Sometimes you have to suffer through dark periods, but then change will come.
Positive and optimistic notes, and I agree that we definitely want to try and sustain this momentum that we have going right now in terms of pushing for better change. And there's so many other parts of this that I'd love to talk to you more about, conscious of time. So I think probably that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really illuminating. I certainly hope we can carry on this conversation in terms of ways that we can think more broadly about decolonizing global health, and ways that Georgetown University can think about doing this at our institutional level, as well as the community, civil society, and family levels that you've talked about as well. So again, thank you so much for your time, and really excited to have you as part of our lecture series, and hope that you can be part of this conversation with us going forward. So thank you again so much for your help.
Dr. Stanley, this has been wonderful.